The battlefield in Ukraine has now turned into a line of fire. While the great offensive operations of the Ukrainians continue in Zaporizhia, fierce clashes are taking place on the front lines of Donetsk and Luhansk. We witnessed Ukrainian control on the Bakhmut and Luhansk sides, but the Ukrainians were not satisfied with these successful actions. The main goal of Kiev's major offensive operations was to dominate the Ukrainian southern front lines and liberate the Crimean Peninsula. To achieve this goal, the Ukrainian army needs to build an offensive corridor stretching from the southern front lines to the peninsula. That's why Kiev has directed the offensive axis of its armed forces to Ukraine's coastlines. Among the offensive directions of the Ukrainian forces are settlements such as Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Tokmak, and Kherson. Last but not least, the city of Berdyansk witnessed very active moments as the Ukrainians carried out a historic offensive operation in the city recently. One of the most striking details of this offensive operation was that the Ukrainian army used weapons systems procured from Western Europe. Let's go to Berdyansk, one of the most important port cities on the coastline of Ukraine where these critical moments are experienced. In Berdyansk, one of the main bases of the Russian Air Force was targeted by the Storm Shadow long-range missile supplied to the Ukrainian forces by the United Kingdom. The Ukrainians hit the main air base in Berdyansk, where the Russians deployed 29 Kar-52 helicopters for a total of 10 Storm Shadows. Satellites photographed 29 Russian Ka-52 military helicopters parked at Berdyansk airport 2 weeks ago. In other words, it looked like Kiev had planned the attack well in advance because it's claimed that this critical intelligence was provided by some international sources. It is possible that the high-tech British Storm Shadow was used in these attacks, but this data hasn't been verified by the authorities. However, considering that Storm Shadow is the missile system with the highest range in the Ukrainian army's inventory, it seems almost certain that the missiles used in this attack were also UK-made Storm Shadows. These stunning Storm Shadow attacks in Berdyansk created a cold shower in Moscow because this was probably the most ambitious and devastating long-range precision-guided weapon attack on the Kremlin military infrastructure by the Kiev mission planners. News and social media videos from the port city showed 6 thick columns of black smoke rising from the vicinity of Berdyansk port, which has been heavily used by the Russian Air Force as a base for at least a dozen combat helicopters since at least mid-June. In a statement made by the Ukrainian army, officials of the Ukrainian armed forces described this attack as successful and claimed that the Russian command and control facilities, supplies, and ammunition were destroyed, without giving the name of the weapon used. According to unconfirmed local Russian accounts, the attacks were carried out by Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the longest-range precision-guided weapon delivered by the British and currently used by the Ukrainian military. Kremlin-supporting Telegram channels, on the other hand, confirmed that the Ukrainians are using Storm Shadow. In fact, the distance between the possible places where the attack took place and the base area used by the Russians in Berdyansk as their main air base clearly confirms this data. Instead of announcing it officially, the Ukrainian authorities were content to celebrate the attack. Kremlin-sponsored military blogger Vladimir Rogov has released images of debris falling from a Storm Shadow missile that air defense units say hit Berdyansk skies. Some Berdyansk social media channels, however, showed a single trace over the city typical of an anti-aircraft missile. Although the Russian media claimed that the Ukrainian forces' offensive in Berdyansk had failed, the situation was plausible. The Russians shot down only one of the 11 Storm Shadow missiles used by the Ukrainians, proving that the attack was actually successful. If Russian forces had managed to shoot down all of the Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles, This news would have made headlines in pro-Moscow media channels. But the news published by international sources on this subject is quite clear. Ukraine destroyed the main base used by the Russian Air Force in Berdyansk on the way to Crimea. It is also claimed that 52 combat helicopters at the Russian main base in the city were also seriously damaged in this attack. Ka-52 attack helicopters can carry long-range anti-tank missiles and are heavily armored. The Berdyansk-based Russian Air Force has been a major hurdle for the Ukrainian forces in the southern Zaporizhia sector, especially since Kiev launched the summer offensive in early June. Missile-carrying Ka-52s launched attacks against armored and tank units of the Ukrainian armed forces on June 8, causing the Ukrainian army to suffer its worst tactical defeat ever in the summer offensive in Kiev. And these reported airstrikes knocked out 5 German-made Leopard 2 tanks and 11 US-made light tanks in the Ukrainian army's inventory. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles were also affected by the Russian Ka-52s. This heavy airstrike by Ukraine showed that it was payback time. This was revenge against the Russian attacks 3 weeks ago with a much bigger attack. The massive presence of Russian helicopters at the Berdyansk airport was widely covered in the Ukrainian media, with satellite images of the base released by US sources in mid-June. However, with the recent missile attacks in Berdyansk, the Ukrainians have prevented the Russians from making flights from this region for a certain period of time. It's thought that Moscow will not reactivate its air force for a long time after the recent attacks in Berdyansk. So why was Russia so worried about these attacks in Berdyansk? On June 13, at least 27 Russian Air Force helicopters were stationed at Berdyansk airfield, including 5 Ka-52 combat helicopters, 9 Mi-8 or Mi-24 attack helicopters, and 13 Ka-29 reconnaissance and rescue helicopters. However, it was claimed that the Russian war helicopters were damaged as a result of the offensive operations of the Ukrainians and that the Russian Air Force did not engage the Air Force in retaliatory attacks in Berdyansk. There were no reports confirming damage to aircraft or combat helicopters of the Russian Air Force at Berdyansk airport. Access to the airbase was blocked by Russian police and security forces. According to reports and social media posts about the attack here, the Russians' blocking of access to the Berdyansk airbase reflects the possibility that the Moscow administration is hiding some realities. If the Russian helicopters had not been damaged, Moscow would have ordered them from its home base in Berdyansk to attack the Ukrainians, as we mentioned. These retaliatory attacks by the Russians were also untargeted, so Ukrainian civilians could be harmed by these attacks. Fortunately, what was expected didn't happen, and the Russians became quite quiet after these attacks. Moscow's concern was that it faced the fear of losing its most important combat helicopters at this air base because Russia's economy is not very suitable for making any innovation or difference in the military field at the moment. The Russians have lost so much military equipment on the battlefield that it may take years for those losses to be restored. So how did the Ukrainians manage to target the airbase in Berdyansk, which the Russians control as perhaps the most strategic region? Almost all the weapons of the Ukrainian army lack the range of 110 to 120 kilometers required to hit Berdyansk from the area currently controlled by the AFU. The only exceptions in the Ukrainian army are the very limited number of locally produced and relatively faulty Krim and Tajku missiles and the modern Franco-British Storm Shadow missile with a reported maximum range of 500 kilometers. Kiev first launched attacks with Storm Shadow in May, carrying a 450-kilogram warhead. Storm Shadow is widely regarded by military analysts as Ukraine's most effective and powerful long-range attack system. In addition, Ukraine's defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, praised Storm Shadow as the deadliest long-range weapon in the Ukrainian Armed Forces arsenal in a national televised program. First of all, the UK didn't approve of the use of such missiles and weapon systems to destroy Crimea or some critical Russian military targets. But the UK released the Ukrainians on this issue after former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev announced that all UK officials should be targeted. In fact, the UK Ministry of Defense has declared that all weapons and missile systems, including Storm Shadow, should be used to attack Russian military targets after Medvedev's wild statements. When the Ukrainian forces received the support from the UK, they tried to expand their offensive access as much as they could. In fact, it wasn't a coincidence that another attack took place in this region on the same day right after the last attacks in the main base area used by the Russians in Berdyansk. You heard right, the same day as the attacks on the airbase in Berdyansk, the Ukrainians continued to hit Russian targets in the city again. The target of the second attack by the Ukrainians on the same day was the Russian military headquarters and ammunition depot in the city. This stunning attack was confirmed by the Ukrainian Armed Forces Strategic Command. Russian authorities confirmed the attack, assuring it was allegedly successfully repelled by Russian air defenses. However, according to footage from the crash site, a massive fire broke out in the Russian main headquarters where the explosions took place after the second attack in Berdyansk. Russian officials and supporters of Moscow in the city were now seriously worried. Pro-Russian supporters in the city think that the Ukrainian attacks will continue. This is a high probability because previously confirmed Storm Shadow attacks on military targets in the Berdyansk region include a 3-missile strike that hit a Russian forward helicopter refueling base near the resort village of Primorsk, destroying the R&R complex. Ukrainians have targeted the city many times and continue to do so. On the other hand, while the successful attacks of the Ukrainian forces continued, U.S. presidential candidate Mike Pence came to Kiev with an unexpected visit. Mr. Pence gave an interview with the American media in which he asked the White House administration to accelerate the supply of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine. Also, Mike Pence met Zelensky during his visit to Kiev. Mr. Pence stated that Putin's army came to Ukraine as a private person to see firsthand the atrocities of Putin's army in Irpin. The American guests managed to visit Bucha and Moshin in addition to Irpin. Mike Pence stated that he would thereafter insist on the speedy transportation of military equipment from the United States. This support gives strength to the Ukrainian army, and Kiev is able to develop offensive operations thanks to military aid from the West and the USA. Therefore, in order for Kiev to continue its struggle for freedom, the military support must be provided to the Ukrainian army continuously and on time. In this regard, the USA has taken action again this week and is announcing new aid packages to Ukraine. However, Ukrainian forces used serious armored vehicles and missiles during the approximately 1-month offensive. For this reason, the Ukrainian army still doesn't have enough equipment to completely repel the Russians. Ammunition isn't unlimited, especially Storm Shadow missiles. The architect of this attack are not unlimited. Ukrainian forces have probably consumed between 50 and 100 Storm Shadows so far. This means stocks are running low. We saw how critical Storm Shadow and its equivalent missiles were for Ukraine's victory in the slump of about 1.5 months. For this reason, it won't be surprising at all that the British government will announce a new package very soon. Contrary to expectations, the Russian army suffered heavy defeats against the Ukrainian army, which is 8 times smaller in quantity and 20 times smaller in terms of military vehicles and ammunition. Russian soldiers refused to fight, fled the front, or surrendered to the Ukrainian army, while earthquakes in the Russian army shook the Kremlin. Great defeats came one after another, both on the Eastern Front, on the Southern Front, and in the Crimea. However, none of these had as much impact as the socio-economic earthquake that Russia has experienced in the last year. Putin's country has reached the level of revolt against the regime under the heaviest sanctions ever. The Ukrainian forces rushed from victory to victory over Russian troops while defending their homeland. Behind this great success is the courage and faith of the Ukrainians. Secondly, the powerful war technologies of the West enable the Ukrainian forces to take a step forward. However, these are not sufficient reasons to explain the depression defeats and retreats of the Russian army. The main reason for the heavy losses of the Russian army is the sending of Russian soldiers to a pointless war. But the lack of ammunition of the Russian troops and the problems in the leadership are seen as well. The biggest problem for Russia here is the existence of a Russian army that cannot meet the needs of its soldiers and sends them to the front naked. And the source of this problem in the Russian army is not as simple as mismanagement. Besides the few reasons we mentioned, the main reason is the Western sanctions against the Russian Federation. Over the past 13 months, Russia has faced many sanctions. Most of them were in the military industry. Sanctions become more and more severe. And finally, the 10th package of sanctions came with the heaviest blow to the Russian army. Vladimir Putin had given the order to occupy Bakhmut by the end of March. However, at the end of February, the 10th and heaviest general sanctions package against Russia became a shield that defended Ukraine at the front. Russia was excluded from most of the world, not only economically, but also politically, culturally, and sportingly. So the scope and severity of the sanctions was unprecedented for an economy the size of Russia. The USA, UK, and France are among the tens of countries that imposed the heaviest sanctions on Russia against Russia's invasion attempt in Ukraine. These countries are followed by European countries close to the Russian border, such as Germany, Poland, and Finland. US and UK sanctions are paralyzing the Russian military industry and other economic spheres in all areas. France also had very remarkable practices. France had already severely punished Putin by closing the Renault factory in Russia and stopping vehicle sales. Now France has frozen assets over the EU's 9th round of sanctions. Now that assets are blocked, the news agency is completely incapable of continuing its operations on the same terms as before, as it can no longer pay salaries and contractors. Russia is facing a severe economic recession, followed by a post-crisis recovery and economic growth that is unlikely to materialize. Russia's economy is in shambles. The 10th package of sanctions from the EU to Russia came at the end of February amid the struggle for Bakhmut chief. Among the changes included in the EU's 10th sanctions package is the ban on Russian citizens and organizations booking gas storage capacity in the Union. Russia's energy is its lifeblood, with European purchases falling significantly in 2023. We can say that Putin's energy lifeline has started to run out. 10th round of EU sanctions hit Russia and others. The European Union has agreed to impose new sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. In the statement made by the EU presidency, it was stated that the restrictions are aimed at military and political decision makers, companies that support or work in the Russian military industry, and Wagner Group commanders. The 10th round of EU sanctions targets around 120 individuals and organizations, including those involved in the abduction of Ukrainian children, those who spread disinformation, Iranians involved in sending drones to Russia, and members and supporters of Wagner Group mercenaries. The statement said that the sanctions restrict the export of electronic components used in Russian weapons, including missiles, drones, and helicopters, and bans some rare earth materials, electronic circuits, and thermal cameras. EU sanctions also ban transactions with 3 more Russian banks and lists 96 more entities, including 7 from Iran, that provide Russia with military drones used in attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, is working to impose sanctions on Russia's nuclear sector and missile program and on anyone involved in the occupying states. Nuclear blackmail. Ukrainian sanctions have also hit the Russian army hard. The situation for Russia's defense and aerospace industries is so bad that they are looking for semiconductors from refrigerators and dishwashers. On the other hand, the United Kingdom brought a new wave of sanctions against Russia due to the Ukraine war. London is now targeting the country's defense and aerospace industries, which support Russian President Vladimir Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. The UK targeted 5 companies in its latest sanctions package, CST, which produces unmanned aerial vehicles for the Russian army, RT, which produces helicopter parts used by the Russian military complex, Oberon Logistics, which facilitates the transport and delivery of Russian military equipment, Universal Mash and Lipetsk, which produce Strak chassis for Russian anti-aircraft guns, and Topaz, which developed the software used by the Russian aerospace forces on helicopters and warplanes. These sanctions increase the pressure on Putin and undermine the war machine that will help Ukraine prevail. The United States announced new sanctions against Russia and a new package of military aid to Ukraine. The latest restrictions target more than 100 organizations, both in Russia and around the world, including banks and defense equipment suppliers. Specifically, the United States said it wanted to stop those who helped Russia exploit loopholes to obtain sanctioned materials. In addition, the White House's new aid to Ukraine is worth $2 billion. An additional $550 million will be provided to both Ukraine and neighboring Moldova to strengthen their energy infrastructure. The most comprehensive sanctions imposed on Russia by Western countries have seriously hit the Russian state society and economy. After these sanctions, Russia will not be the same as before. It will cut the country off from the global economy while changing the way of life of the Russian people. So far, Putin has been telling the Russians that a special military operation is being waged, not a war that will impose hard sacrifices on the people. But as time went on, the cost of the war and the effects of the sanctions on ordinary Russian citizens increased even more. Belts are tightened in Russia. Some industries have been hit hard. In short, the increase in the cost of both the war and the sanctions plays a decisive role in Russia's war with Ukraine. So can these sanctions bring Russian leader Vladimir Putin to his knees? The threat of sanctions did not stop Russian President Vladimir Putin, but the prolongation of the war, its growing influence on citizens, and the resulting inability to meet the needs at the front could help end the war. No one can say for sure when the war will end, but we can expect it to end with a deal. Putin's army is performing quite poorly, but no matter how bad it looks, it has the potential to make the conflict all the more terrifying in the months to come. The strength and weight of the sanctions and their visible negative impact on the Russian economy will likely spur Putin to seek an earlier resolution and could be leveraged against Russia's most dire demands. In addition, although the sanctions do not end this war, they are important both in terms of being the first urgent steps to be taken towards ensuring reliability and deterring other actors who may take similar initiatives in the future. Another important point is that failure to overthrow the Kiev government and subdue the Ukrainian people will cost Russia more than the weight of Western sanctions. Sanctions may help stop the Russian offensive, but they will not change Russia's stance in a day, of course. But one important criterion is that the sanctions will help keep Ukraine's morale high on the ground, and for the most important sanctions to work, it takes time. The role of sanctions in ending the war also depends on how Putin shapes his calculations. The war triggered by Russia shattered Europe's security architecture. As long as Russia continues to be run by Putin, There is no return to cooperation with Moscow, and there are no signs of such a change. Ukraine is fighting a great struggle and is doing everything it can do to defend European values. So we can say that Ukraine is also fighting for European security and needs all kinds of tools to resist the Russian attack. Therefore, the EU must do absolutely everything to help Ukraine. In short, the Russian economy seems to force the Kremlin to stop its war in Ukraine sooner or later because the bill of a new military intervention is getting heavier. The country is facing a severe economic recession, declining living standards, and hopelessness of a speedy recovery, and most importantly, in serious trouble at the front. There is a lot of good news from the backward direction. First of all, more information became available about yesterday's assault on the southern flank. Today, it became clearer that Ukrainians did not attack Russian positions in France simultaneously, but rather started shaving them off from the corner near the forest. This explains how most Russians managed to run away before Ukrainians reached their positions. Russians would receive a message about the attack from one group and then lose connection. Receive a message about the attack from the second group and lose connection. And when they understood that they were the next on the line, they would run away. Yesterday, in the late evening, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Assault Brigade reported that they managed to penetrate Russian defense by 2.6 kilometers deep on a 3-kilometer wide front. But it looks like this was only the beginning, because today Ukrainians released footage showing how they are already operating almost 3 kilometers away from yesterday's positions, clearing the tree line near Koryukovka. The video featured the same 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Assault Brigade and showed how they approached the trenches under the cover of M113. The fighters successfully suppressed the enemy fire and reached the enemy trenches. Since there are several trenches along the tree line, a small group would stay to clear the position, while other troops with the vehicle would continue their movement towards the next fortification. As a result, all positions were cleared, and the fighters reported collecting a lot of trophies such as machine guns, grenade throwers, sniper rifles, and ammunition. In the meantime, Ukrainian artillery has increased their focus on this flank and started undermining the next Russian positions on the line. Geolocated footage showed how Ukrainians set on fire a Russian shelter just south of Ivanovskaya. Russians tried to extinguish the fire. However, in the end, they just chose to abandon their positions and ran towards Kievska. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian artillery is also actively firing at Russian positions in Kievska. Recently released footage shows how Ukrainians started destroying Russian warehouses with fuel and ammunition. The coordinated work with drone reconnaissance and artillery resulted in the destruction of at least 2 warehouses. Ukrainian artillery crews also fired at Russian objects in a small settlement south of Kaliska. After several strikes, Ukrainian drone operators also noticed an increased movement of vehicles. It looks like the Russians got concerned about the strikes together with the recent frontline penetrations and decided to relocate their equipment before it was destroyed by the artillery. However, thanks to the drone operator, the artillery fire followed the Russians through the field, which resulted in multiple pieces of equipment being destroyed. The fact that Ukrainians increased the area of operation from 3 kilometers to 6 kilometers, cleared almost all positions west of Kazhumyaka, forced Russians to abandon their positions south of Ivanovsky, and destroyed multiple warehouses and pieces of equipment around. Kaliska suggests that the most undersupplied and tactically vulnerable part of the front is the forest. Now, as their supplies are essentially cut, Ukrainians can attack them from several directions at once, provide fire support west of the canal, and they should run out of supplies in a matter of hours. Given that there is only one retreat route along the tree line, which is also under fire control, the chances of survival, even during the retreat, are very slim. Once the forest is cleared, Ukrainians can safely move along the canal and attack not only Kievska but also Andriivka and Kazhumyaka. And once a powerful bridgehead east of the canal is established, Ukrainians can use this ground to launch a large-scale mechanized assault to start encircling the Wagner Group from the south.